The courtroom went dead silent as Brick Sterling leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought stripping his wife Calla of her home, her dignity, and her finances was the final victory in his sordid game of betrayal. He had the high-priced lawyers, the forged evidence, and the mistress waiting in the wings. But Brick made one fatal calculation error. He mistook Calla's silence for weakness. He didn't know that the poor orphan he married was the sole heir to the very capital firm that owned his company. And sitting in the back row, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, was the man who could destroy Brick with a single signature, Calla's uncle. This is the story of how an arrogant CEO lost everything in a single afternoon. The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B of the Superior Court of New York was stifling. It smelled of old wood polish, stale coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of imminent ruin. Outside, the autumn rain battered the windows, a grey backdrop to the brutal dismantling of a marriage that was taking place inside. Brick Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table, impeccably dressed in a bespoke navy suit that likely cost more than most people's cars. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe, with an air of bored impatience. To him, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction, a business deal gone sour that needed to be liquidated so he could move on to the next investment. Across the aisle sat Calla. She looked nothing like the vibrant woman who had graced the society pages 3 years ago as the Cinderella bride. Today she wore a simple grey cardigan and black slacks. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany grain of the table before her. She looked defeated, small, insignificant, exactly how Brick wanted her. "Your Honor," boomed Brick's lawyer, a man named Richard Blackwood, who was known in the city as the Vulture. He paced before Judge Thaddeus Moore, gesturing theatrically toward Calla. "We are not just asking for a dissolution of marriage. We are asking for justice. My client, Mr. Sterling, has been the victim of a sophisticated fraud." Judge Moore, a man with bushy grey eyebrows and a low tolerance for theatrics, peered over his glasses. "Fraud is a strong word, Mr. Blackwood. This is a divorce hearing. It is the only word that fits your honor." Blackwood pressed his voice, dripping with mock sympathy. The defendant Calla Vance presented herself as a woman of virtue, a supportive partner. Instead, she has proven to be a leech, a woman who married Mr. Sterling solely for his assets, contributed nothing to his empire, and as we will demonstrate, attempted to siphon funds from Sterling Tech into private offshore accounts. A murmur rippled through the gallery. In the back row, Isabella Thorne sat with her legs crossed, wearing a bright red dress that was entirely inappropriate for court. She was Brick's executive assistant, a title that fooled absolutely no one. She caught Brick's eye and offered a subtle, predatory smile. Calla didn't flinch. She didn't object. She just sat there, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "My client," Blackwood continued, ramping up the volume, "built Sterling Tech from the ground up. He is a self-made visionary. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps to create a company valued at $400 million. Ms. Vance, on the other hand, was a waitress when he found her. He gave her a life of luxury. He gave her a world she could never have dreamed of. And how did she repay him? With infidelity and embezzlement." Brick leaned forward, whispering loudly enough for the court reporter to hear. "Just get it over with, Richard. I want her out of my life by lunch." The cruelty was casual, practiced. It was the same tone he had used 3 weeks ago when he had thrown Calla out of their penthouse. Flashback. It had been raining then too. Brick had stood by the door, Isabella clinging to his arm. "Get out," he had said, tossing Calla's suitcase onto the wet pavement of the private driveway. "The locks are changed. The cards are cancelled. You're nothing, Ellie. You were nothing when I met you, and you're nothing now." Isabella had laughed, a cold, tinkling sound. "Don't worry, honey. I'll take good care of the master bedroom." Back in the courtroom, Blackwood slammed a heavy binder onto the judge's bench. "Exhibit A, Your Honor. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers. We are petitioning for a complete nullification of the prenuptial agreement's payout clause due to a breach of good faith. Mr. Sterling is willing to offer a one-time charity payment of $5,000 to help Ms. Vance find a motel. Beyond that, she deserves nothing." $5,000. From a man whose company she had quietly helped nurture during his darkest depressive episodes. From a man whose social standing she had secured with her grace and etiquette. The judge looked at the binder, then at Calla. "Ms. Vance," Judge Moore said, his voice stern. "You are representing yourself today. Your previous counsel withdrew." Calla finally looked up. Her eyes were clear blue and terrifyingly calm. "Mr. Blackwood threatened my previous attorney with disbarment over a fabricated conflict of interest." "Your Honor, I couldn't afford another retainer after Brick froze our joint accounts. So yes, I am representing myself." "And how do you respond to these allegations?" the judge asked. Calla stood up. She didn't shake. "I deny them, Your Honor. But more importantly, I believe Mr. Blackwood is operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts." Brick scoffed an audible sound that echoed in the room. "She's going to cry," he muttered to Blackwood. "Here comes the sob story about her difficult childhood." "The misunderstanding," Calla continued, her voice gaining strength, "is regarding the true ownership of Sterling Tech and who exactly brought the capital to the marriage." Blackwood laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "Your Honor, this is delusional. The woman was a waitress at a diner in Brooklyn. My client is the CEO." "Is he?" Calla asked softly. "Order." Judge Moore banged his gavel, silencing the snickers coming from Isabella's section of the gallery. "Ms. Vance, proceed. But be warned, I have a full docket today. If this is a stalling tactic, it will not end well for you." "It is not a stall, Your Honor," Calla said, walking slowly toward the witness stand where the clerk was organizing files. "Mr. Blackwood claims I am a gold digger. He claims I embezzled money. May I see the proofs?" Blackwood smirked and handed her a copy of the binder. "Read it and weep, darling. It's all there. The transfers to the Cayman Islands. The dates coincide with your solo trips to visit your sick aunt." Calla opened the binder. She flipped through the pages with a practiced eye. Fake wire transfers, forged signatures. It was a sloppy job likely put together by Brick's corrupt CFO, a man named Greg Halloway, who would do anything for a bonus. "Brick," Calla said, turning to face her husband directly. This was a breach of protocol, but the judge didn't stop her. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice that these transfer codes are outdated? Swift codes changed for the Cayman branch 6 months before these dates." Brick stiffened. "Objection," Blackwood shouted. "The defendant is not a forensic accountant." "No," Calla said, closing the binder. "But I am the one who taught Brick how to read a balance sheet." "Lies." Brick stood up, his face flushing red. "You were a college dropout. I found you serving coffee. I made you." "You found me serving coffee because I was researching," Calla said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. I was trying to understand the lives of the people my family employs. I wanted to be grounded before I took on my responsibilities. Your family. Brick laughed, looking around the courtroom as if inviting everyone to share the joke. Your family is dead, Ellie. You told me yourself. Parents died in a car crash. No siblings. You're a stray. My parents are dead, Calla confirmed. A flash of pain crossed her face, but she suppressed it instantly. That part was true. But I never told you I didn't have family. You just never asked. You were always too busy talking about yourself, Brick. In 3 years of marriage, you never once asked what my mother's maiden name was. Who cares what her maiden name was? Blackwood interrupted, sensing the shift in the room's energy and trying to regain control. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We have proof of theft. We have proof of moral turpitude. Blackwood pulled out a second document. We also have sworn affidavits from staff members stating that Ms. Vance was abusive to household employees. Calla sighed. Affidavits signed by the staff you hired last month. Brick, after you fired the housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, who had been with us for 2 years, because she refused to lie for you. Your Honor, Blackwood shouted. Enough. Judge Moore rubbed his temples. Ms. Vance, you are making vague allusions to family and ownership. Do you have evidence to refute these financial claims, or are you just wasting the court's time? I have a witness, Your Honor, Calla said. A witness, Brick sneered. Who, the fry cook from the diner? No, Calla said. She turned toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. I call Sir Arthur Kingsley to the stand. The silence that followed was absolute. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Even Judge Moore looked up sharply. Sir Arthur Kingsley was not just a name. He was an institution. He was the head of Kingsley Global, a venture capital firm based in London that controlled assets larger than the GDP of some small countries. He was a recluse, a man who rarely appeared in public, and certainly never in a low-level divorce court in New York. Brick froze. His face went pale. He knew the name. Everyone in business knew the name. Kingsley Global was the silent angel investor that had saved Sterling Tech from bankruptcy 5 years ago. It was Kingsley Global that held the controlling 51% voting rights in Brick's company rights they had always let Brick manage by proxy. Sir Arthur Kingsley, Judge Moore asked, skeptical. You expect us to believe the Knight of the British realm is here? He is, Calla said. The double doors groaned open. 2 large men in dark suits stepped in, first scanning the room. Then an older man walked in. He was in his 60s, leaning on a cane with a silver handle shaped like a lion's head. He wore a 3-piece tweed suit that looked timeless and expensive. He had a shock of white hair and eyes that were the exact same shade of piercing blue as Calla's. The air in the room seemed to be sucked out. Isabella Thorne stopped chewing her gum. Brick Sterling slumped in his chair, his mouth slightly open. The old man walked down the center aisle, the tap-tap-tap of his cane echoing on the floorboards. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Brick. He looked solely at Calla. He reached the defense table, stopped, and bowed his head slightly to her. I apologize for the delay, my dear. The man said, his voice a rich baritone that carried effortlessly. Traffic on the bridge was dreadful. I assume this individual hasn't bored you to death yet. Calla smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed her face. Hello, Uncle Arthur. Uncle. Brick whispered the word escaping his lips like a dying breath. Mr. Blackwood, the shark lawyer, looked as if he had just swallowed a hook. He scrambled to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular. This man is not on the witness list. I am not a witness, Sir Arthur said, turning slowly to face the trembling lawyer. I am an interested party, and I am the owner of the company you seem to think your client built. Judge Moore looked at the docket, then at Sir Arthur. Sir Arthur, if you are indeed who you say you are, this changes the jurisdiction of the assets entirely. I have the incorporation papers here, Arthur said, snapping his fingers. One of his bodyguards placed a thick briefcase on the table. And the trust documents. You see, Your Honor, Sterling Tech was not built on Mr. Sterling's genius. It was built on the Kingsley family trust. Specifically the trust belonging to my niece, Lady Calla Vance Kingsley. Lady, Isabella gasped from the back row. Brick looked at Calla, his eyes wide with horror. Lady. Calla turned to him, her expression cool and detached. I told you, Brick. You never asked about my mother. Her name was Victoria Kingsley, and you didn't marry a waitress. You married the woman who signed your paychecks. The courtroom buzzed with the kind of chaotic energy usually reserved for a boxing match, not a divorce hearing. Judge Moore banged his gavel, the sharp cracks cutting through the murmurs, but his eyes remained fixed on the documents Sir Arthur had placed on the bench. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Moore said, his voice dangerously low, are you aware of the corporate structure detailed in these documents? Richard Blackwood was sweating. The sheen of perspiration on his forehead was visible even from the gallery. He flipped through his own papers, his hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, these are surprise exhibits. We haven't had time to authenticate. They are notarized by the High Court of London and the Secretary of State, Judge Moore snapped. According to this, Sterling Tech is a subsidiary of Vance Holdings, which is a shell company fully owned by the Kingsley Trust. Mr. Sterling owns, let me see here, exactly 2% of the shares. The rest are held in his name as a proxy for the trust. Brick stood up, his legs wobbly. That's a lie. I built that company. I signed the deals. Sir Arthur turned, leaning heavily on his cane, but looking like a titan. You signed the papers I put in front of you, boy. Do you remember 5 years ago you were drowning in debt from that failed cryptocurrency venture? You were going to lose your apartment. You met Calla a week later. You thought she was a pretty waitress who could comfort you. In reality, she saw potential in your software code, despite your incompetence as a businessman. Calla stepped forward, picking up the narrative. I petitioned the trust to bail you out, Brick. I believed in the product, but my uncle didn't trust you. So we made a deal. The trust would buy the debt and capitalize the company, but the ownership would remain with me until I deemed you safe. You were never the CEO, Brick. You were a glorified employee with a fancy title and a proxy vote. And the embezzlement, Brick croaked, pointing a shaking finger at the binder of evidence his lawyer had presented earlier. She stole $3 million. The transfers are right there. Calla walked over to the plaintiff's table. She looked down at Brick with pity. Open page 14 of your own evidence binder. Brick. Brick didn't move. Blackwood opened it. Read the destination of the funds, Calla commanded. Blackwood adjusted his glasses. Beneficiary, Orion Gaming Liquidation Fund. Does that ring a bell, Brick? Calla asked softly. The color drained from Brick's face. Last year, Calla addressed the judge, Mr. Sterling developed a gambling problem. High-stakes poker in Macau and underground games in Jersey. He racked up $3 million in debt to to people who don't send invoices. They send bone breakers. He was terrified. He came home crying one night, claiming he had made a bad investment. I knew the truth. I withdrew the money from my trust allowance, not the company accounts, to pay off his debt so he wouldn't be killed. I routed it through the company so it would look like a business loss write-off to save his reputation. The courtroom gasped. "I saved your life," Calla whispered, her voice trembling with the first sign of real emotion. "I stripped my own savings to keep your kneecaps intact. And you used that transfer as proof that I was stealing from you." Brick slumped back into his chair. He looked like a deflated balloon. The narrative he had constructed the self-made man and the leeching wife had just been incinerated. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Moore said, closing the file, "it appears your client has committed perjury by filing a false financial statement. And frankly, if these trust documents hold up, Mr. Sterling doesn't have any assets to divide. He is essentially an employee facing termination." "Wait," Brick said, a sudden desperate light entering his eyes. "The prenup. The prenup is ironclad. It says any appreciation of assets during the marriage is split 50-50. Even if she owns the company, the value went up. I'm entitled to half the growth." Isabella in the back perked up. Half of $1 billion growth was still a fortune. Calla smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "I was hoping you would bring up the prenup, Brick." Calla walked back to her table and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the original prenuptial agreement. "You were so insistent on this, Brick," Calla said, holding the paper up. "Do you remember? You made me sign it 3 days before the wedding. You told me, I need to protect my empire from gold diggers. You didn't let me have a lawyer review it. You said if I loved you, I'd sign." "And you did," Brick spat. "You signed it. 50-50 on asset growth. That's the law." "Actually," Calla said, "I did read it. And I noticed a clause your previous lawyer, the one you fired for being too expensive, inserted. Clause 14, Section B, the infidelity forfeiture clause." Blackwood froze. He began frantically flipping through his copy of the prenup. "You see," Calla explained to the rapt audience, "Brick was so arrogant, so sure that I would be the one to cheat on him, the poor waitress looking for a better deal, that he insisted on a clause stating that if either party is proven to have committed adultery, they forfeit all claims to marital assets and are liable for the other party's legal fees." "But you can't prove I cheated," Brick yelled. "Isabella is my assistant." "You have no proof." Isabella shrank down in her seat, trying to become invisible. "Oh, I think we do," Sir Arthur interrupted. He gestured to the large screen mounted on the courtroom wall, usually used for displaying evidence diagrams. "If I may, Your Honor, a submission from a private investigator hired by the Kingsley Trust." Judge Moore nodded. "Proceed." The screen flickered to life. It wasn't grainy footage or blurry photos. It was crystal clear 4K video. The video showed the interior of the Sterling Tech private elevator. The timestamp was from 2 weeks prior, the day before Brick had kicked Calla out. In the video, Brick and Isabella were clearly intimate. They were laughing. Audio from the video played over the speakers. "Brick, I'm tossing her out tomorrow. The lawyers have the papers ready." Isabella, "Finally. I'm sick of sneaking around. Are you sure she won't get half Brick? She won't get a dime. She's stupid, Izzy. She doesn't understand money. I'll give her $5,000 and she'll probably thank me. Then the penthouse is yours." The video froze on Brick's laughing face. In the courtroom, the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of Isabella Thorne grabbing her purse and sprinting out the back door. The click-clack of her heels fading away was the sound of Brick's support system vanishing. "Isabella!" Brick shouted, turning around. But she was gone. "Clause 14, Section B," Calla read aloud. "In the event of infidelity, the offending party forfeits all rights to asset appreciation and alimony. Furthermore, the offending party must vacate all shared residences immediately." Judge Moore looked at Brick with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Sterling, it seems you drafted the instrument of your own destruction. The court finds the prenuptial agreement valid and enforceable against the plaintiff." This can't be happening," Brick stammered. He looked at Blackwood. "Do something, fix this." Blackwood began packing his briefcase. "Mr. Sterling, my retainer covers divorce representation. It does not cover defending against fraud charges or perjury. And considering your assets have just been revealed to be non-existent, I doubt you can afford my hourly rate for the remainder of this hearing." "You're leaving?" Brick gasped. "I'm mitigating my losses," Blackwood said, snapping his briefcase shut. "Good luck, Brick." As the lawyer walked out, Brick sat alone at the large table. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and was waiting for the punishment. "I'm not done," Sir Arthur said from the witness stand. "Your Honour, the divorce is one matter, but there is the matter of the company." Sir Arthur Kingsley didn't need a boardroom. He turned the courtroom into his office. He pulled a sleek black satellite phone from his pocket. "Sir Arthur, no phones in court," Judge Moore warned, though half-heartedly. "Forgive me, Your Honour, but this is relevant to the defendant's financial status, which is central to the case." Arthur put the phone on speaker and held it up. "Connect me to the Sterling Tech Board of Directors. Emergency override code Kingsley Alpha 1. A robotic voice confirmed the code, and within seconds, a series of beeps indicated a conference call had been connected. Voices clamored on the line. "This is the board," a shaky voice said. It was Greg Halloway, the CFO, who had helped Brick forge the documents. "Who is this?" "This is Sir Arthur Kingsley," the old man boomed. "I am currently in New York Superior Court with your CEO, Brick Sterling." "Sir Arthur," Halloway's voice cracked. We weren't expecting." "Clearly." Arthur cut him off. "I am enacting Article 5 of the Incorporation Charter. Immediate removal of the CEO due to gross misconduct, public reputational damage and fraud." Brick jumped up, grabbing the edge of the table. "You can't do that. The board loves me. I made them rich." "The board," Arthur said into the phone, "will vote now. All in favor of removing Brick Sterling effective immediately and stripping him of all stock options." "Yes," Halloway said instantly. "Yes," said another voice. "Yes, yes." It was unanimous. The rats were fleeing the sinking ship. "Brick Sterling is fired," Arthur announced to the room. "Furthermore, Mr. Halloway, you are to lock Mr. Sterling's corporate access badges and wipe his devices remotely, right now." Brick pulled his phone out of his pocket. The screen went black. A white spinning wheel appeared, followed by a factory reset icon. All his contacts, his emails, his access to his bank accounts wiped in seconds. No, Brick tapped the screen frantically. "My crypto wallet keys were in the Notes app. You just deleted $300,000 in Bitcoin." "Consider it a severance tax," Arthur said dryly. Judge Moore cleared his throat. "The court has heard enough. I am granting the dissolution of marriage. Vance retains full ownership of all properties and assets held in the trust." Mr. Sterling is ordered to vacate the premises of the marital home by—" The judge looked at the clock. "Well, since he locked Miss Vance out 3 weeks ago, I'd say immediate eviction is fair. Miss Vance, do you want the police to escort him to retrieve his personal effects?" Calla stood up. She looked tall, elegant, and powerful. She looked at Brick, who was staring at his blank phone, trembling. "No, Your Honor," Calla said. "I don't want him in the house at all. He can have whatever is in his pockets. Everything inside the penthouse, the clothes, the watches, the art was bought with my family's money. It stays." "But my suits," Brick whimpered. "I have nowhere to go." "You have $5,000, Calla reminded him, echoing his cruelty from 3 weeks ago. "I suggest you find a motel. I hear the ones in Queens have vacancies." She turned to the bailiff. "Can we have him removed? He's trespassing on my time." 2 bailiffs moved toward Brick. He looked around the room, hoping for a friendly face. There were none. Even the court reporter looked at him with disdain. "Ellie, please," Brick begged, as the bailiff took his arm. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in the stress. I love you. We can work this out. I'm a visionary. You need me to run the company." "I already hired a new CEO this morning," Calla said calmly. "She starts Monday. Goodbye, Brick." "She—" Brick blurted out, as he was dragged toward the doors. "Yes, Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper you fired. Turns out she has a PhD in operations management she never told you about. She's much more qualified than you." The doors swung shut behind Brick, cutting off his protests. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then Judge Moore capped his pen. "Case closed," he said. "Ms. Vance, or should I say, Lady Kingsley, welcome back to your life." But the story wasn't over. Brick was down, but a man with that much pride doesn't vanish quietly, and karma wasn't done with him yet. The heavy oak doors of the Superior Court closed behind Brick Sterling, with a finality that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut. For the first 10 minutes he simply stood under the courthouse awning, staring at the deluge of rain hammering the New York pavement. He reached into his pocket for his smartphone, a reflex honed over a decade of constant connectivity, only to pull out the factory reset device. It was a sleek black slab of glass that was now utterly useless. No contacts, no banking apps, no Uber. No way to call the driver who was supposed to be waiting for him. "Move along, pal," a court security officer muttered, nudging Brick's shoulder. "You can't loiter here. The media is setting up for the next trial." Brick stumbled out into the rain. The water soaked through his bespoke Italian wool suit, instantly turning the fabric heavy and cold. He raised a hand to hail a yellow taxi, something he hadn't done since he was 22. But 3 cabs sped past him, their occupied lights glowing like taunts. When one finally pulled over the driver, a man with a thick beard and tired eyes took one look at Brick's soaking wet, frantic appearance and kept the window rolled up halfway. "Cash only," the driver shouted over the rain. "Card machine is broken." Brick patted his pockets. He had the debit card the bailiff had handed him, the one with Calla's charity, of $5,000, but he had no cash. I need to get to a bank," Brick stammered. "I'm Brick Sterling. I'll pay you triple once we get there." The driver scoffed. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Walk, buddy." The taxi screeched away, splashing a wave of dirty gutter water onto Brick's trousers. He ended up walking. He walked 40 blocks north, his expensive leather dress shoes, designed for boardrooms and carpets blistering his heels with every step. He wasn't just walking toward shelter. He was walking toward the only lifeline he thought he had left. He headed for the Upper East Side to the penthouse of Brad Salinger. Brad was a hedge fund manager, a drinking buddy, and a man Brick had personally enriched with insider tips on tech mergers for years. They were brothers. They had toasted to their own genius on yachts in the Mediterranean. Brad would help. He had to. When Brick arrived at the gilded entrance of the Kensington, he looked like a drowned rat. His hair was plastered to his skull and his suit was ruined. The doorman, a man named Henry, whom Brick had tipped hundreds of dollars to in the past, blocked the revolving door with a gloved hand. "I'm here to see Mr. Salinger," Brick gasped, wiping water from his eyes. "It's an emergency. Tell him it's Brick." Henry didn't move. He didn't smile. He picked up the lobby phone, turned his back to Brick, and spoke in a hushed tone. A moment later he hung up and turned back to the glass. "Mr. Salinger is not accepting visitors," Henry said, his voice muffled by the thick glass. "Tell him it's Brick," Brick screamed, slamming his palm against the door. "I gave him the tip on the Omnicorp merger. He owes me." Henry opened the door just a crack, sliding a small envelope through. "Mr. Salinger asked me to give you this, and he said if you don't leave the premises in 30 seconds, he is authorized to call the precinct." Brick tore the envelope open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single, crisp $20 bill and a business card for a homeless shelter in the Bronx. Brick stared at the money. The insult was so sharp, it felt like a physical stab wound. Brad wasn't just rejecting him, he was erasing him. To men like Brad, friendship was a transaction. Brick was no longer an asset, he was a liability, a walking contagion of bad PR. He dropped the $20 into a puddle and turned away, the shame burning hotter than the cold rain. That night, Brick checked into the Starlight Motel in Queens. It was the only place he could find that accepted a walk-in with no luggage and a debit card that required 3 authorization attempts to go through. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial-strength lemon cleaner, a scent that would haunt him for years. He sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, stripping off his wet socks. He was hungry, starving actually, but the idea of going out to find food was impossible. He felt exposed as if the word fraud was tattooed on his forehead. He turned on the small boxy television bolted to the dresser. He needed to know how bad it was. He flipped to CNBC. The headline on the ticker at the bottom of the screen made his blood run cold. Sterling Tech shares surge 12% after ousting of CEO. Brick scrambled off the bed, kneeling in front of the TV. "It's a remarkable turnaround," a sleek-haired financial analyst was saying. "Wall Street has reacted with overwhelming positivity to the news that Brick Sterling has been removed. For years there were rumors that Sterling was merely a figurehead, and today's revelation that the Kingsley Trust, and specifically Lady Calla Vance, holds the controlling interest has restored immense confidence. The market loves stability, and frankly they love that the dead weight is gone." "Dead weight," Brick whispered. "I built that code. I pulled the all-nighters." But the news got worse. In related news, the anchor continued, the district attorney's office has announced a formal investigation into the embezzlement allegations. Sources say former CFO Greg Holloway is cooperating fully in exchange for immunity. Holloway has allegedly provided hard drives containing evidence of wire fraud and digital asset manipulation. Brick collapsed back onto the floor. The hard drives. He had thought Greg was loyal. He had paid Greg's mortgage off 2 years ago as a bonus. But loyalty, Brick was learning, was a luxury only the rich could afford. Then a sudden horrifying realization hit him. His crypto wallets. He scrambled for his factory reset phone. He had kept his private keys, the long, complex passwords, to access his Bitcoin and Ethereum stashes in the Secure Notes app on his phone. He had never written them down on paper because he was paranoid about physical theft. He thought the cloud was safe. But Sir Arthur had wiped the device. Brick tapped the screen, frantically reinstalling the app, praying for a backup. Login failed. Account not found. He tried again. And again. Account wiped by administrator. $300,000. His escape fund, his safety net. It was gone. Deleted in a microsecond by an old man with a cane. The money existed somewhere in the blockchain ether, locked in a digital vault that Brick could never open again. He was locked out of his own life. The next 3 weeks were a slow-motion car crash. Brick hired a lawyer he found on a bus bench at a man named Saul Berkowitz, whose office was above a laundromat. Saul smelled of onions and seemed more interested in Brick's watch than his case. "Here's the deal," Saul said, chewing on a toothpick. "You sell the Patek Philippe that covers my retainer. But looking at this, Holloway sang like a canary, kid. They have the IP addresses, they have the bank transfers. You're looking at 5 to 10 years for wire fraud." "I can't go to prison," Brick whispered. I'm not built for that." "Then you need to pay restitution," Saul said. "You pay back the $3 million you borrowed for the gambling debts, and maybe we can get it plead down to a misdemeanor and probation. Do you have $3 million? "I have $4,000 left," Brick said. Saul shrugged. "Then you better find a job, a good one." Brick tried. God, he tried. He bought a cheap suit from a thrift store that smelled of mothballs and hit the pavement. He still had his MBA. He still had his experience. Surely someone would see past the scandal. He landed an interview at a mid-sized logistics firm in Jersey City. The hiring manager was a woman named Karen, who he realized with a jolt of horror he had once berated at a tech conference 3 years ago for blocking the buffet line. She recognized him immediately. "Brick Sterling," she said, leaning back in her chair, a cruel smile playing on her lips. The man who said, "Logistics is for people who aren't smart enough to code." I was under a lot of stress back then." Brick said, his hands sweating. "I admire your company, Karen. I can bring operational efficiency." She let him talk for 10 minutes. She watched him squirm. She enjoyed it. "You know, Brick," she said, finally closing his folder. "We do have an opening. In the warehouse, loading trucks. Night shift. Minimum wage." Brick stood up, his face burning. "I was a CEO." "You were a husband who got fired by his wife," Karen corrected him. "And frankly, based on your balance sheets, you weren't a very good CEO either. Take the warehouse job or leave it." He left. But by the 5th rejection, the warehouse job started sounding like a dream. He was rejected by startups run by 20-year-olds in hoodies who laughed at his boomer energy. He was rejected by consulting firms who simply Googled his name during the interview and asked him to leave the building. He was radioactive. By month 4, the money was gone. He stood in a pawn shop on 8th Avenue, watching a man with a loupe examine his Patek Philippe. It was a limited edition worth $80,000 new. $5,000, the pawnbroker grunted. "It's worth 80, Brick cried. "Look at the movement. It's Swiss. It's scratched," the man lied. "And it's stolen property, for all I know." Take the 5 or get out. Get out. Brick took the 5. It paid for another 2 months at the motel and the legal fees to keep Saul from quitting. He sold his cufflinks next, then his designer sunglasses, then the leather briefcase Calla had bought him for their first anniversary. He watched his identity be dismantled piece by piece, sold for pennies on the dollar to strangers. He stopped eating 3 meals a day. He started skipping lunch. He lost weight. His face became gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by insomnia and stress. The arrogance that had defined his posture evaporated, replaced by a permanent jittery flinch. He jumped when sirens went off. He avoided eye contact with people on the street, terrified he would be recognized, yet devastated that he was now invisible. One Tuesday, sitting in the motel room, eating a cup of instant noodles, he saw an ad in the local paper. High-end event staff needed. Valet and coat check. Immediate start. Cash tips. It was humiliating. It was beneath him. It was exactly the kind of job he used to mock. But Saul had called that morning. The DA is pushing for a trial date, Brick. I need more money for the forensic accountant, or we're dead in the water. Brick circled the ad with a trembling hand. The interview for the valet company was brief. They didn't Google him. They just checked if he had a valid driver's license and could drive a stick shift. You look like you've been through the ringer, pal, the manager, a beefy guy named Tony, said, handing him a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big. Don't crash the cars, don't steal the change in the ashtrays, and smile at the rich folks. They like it when you bow a little. I can do that, Brick whispered. Putting on the uniform was the final surrender. The polyester scratched his skin. The pants were too short. The name tag was cheap plastic with a label maker strip that just said, Mark. To Saul. Brick Sterling, the visionary, the CEO, the man who was going to change the world, was dead. In his place stood Mark the valet, a ghost haunting the parking lots of the elite, parking the cars of men he used to call peers, waiting for the final blow that he knew deep down was still coming. 6 months later, New York City was dressed in its finest evening wear for the event of the season. The inaugural gala for the Vance Foundation for Digital Literacy. The venue was the Pierre Hotel on 5th Avenue, a fortress of limestone and light that glowed like a beacon against the darkening November sky. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers trembled from the vibrations of a live orchestra, and champagne flowed like water. The guest list was a who's who of the global elite tech moguls, senators, foreign dignitaries, and old money families who had ruled the city for generations. Outside on the curb, the reality was starkly different. A biting wind whipped down the avenue, carrying with it a mixture of sleet and exhaust fumes. Standing at the valet podium, shivering in a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big, was a man named Mark. To the guests handing him their keys, Mark was invisible. He was a prop, a mechanism to move their Ferraris and Aston Martins to the underground garage. None of them looked at his face, which was gaunt and pale. The skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. None of them noticed the hollow, haunted look in his eyes, or the way his hands trembled when the temperature dropped. And none of them recognized Brick Sterling, the man who less than a year ago would have been inside the ballroom, holding a flute of Dom Perignon and holding court at the head table. "Hey, buddy, wake up." A set of keys hit Brick in the chest, snapping him out of his daze. Brick fumbled to catch them. He looked up to see a man in a tuxedo looking at him with disdain. Brick's stomach lurched. It was Jason Thorpe, the CEO of a cloud computing rival Brick had once tried to acquire in a hostile takeover. "Don't scratch it," Thorpe snapped, gesturing to a sleek black Bentley Continental. "It's worth more than your whole life." "Yes, sir," Brick whispered, keeping his head bowed low so the brim of his cap shadowed his face. He climbed into the Bentley. The smell of the interior rich leather expensive cologne and the faint scent of success hit him like a physical blow. It smelled like his old life. It smelled like the days when he was the one tossing keys to someone else. He gripped the steering wheel, fighting back hot, stinging tears. This is a mistake, he thought, his mind spiraling into the delusion that had kept him sane for weeks. "I'll be back on top soon. This is just a strategy, a temporary setback." But as he parked the car in the dark, grease-stained garage and trudged back up the concrete ramp to the street, the cold air slapped the delusion out of him. He wasn't a CEO on a break. He was a valet out on bail working for tips to pay a lawyer who barely remembered his name. "Heads up, Mark," the valet captain. A burly man named Tony barked. "Big arrival. The guest of honor. VIP protocol. Open the door. Don't speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, stand up straight." A hush fell over the entrance. The paparazzi, who had been chatting idly behind the velvet ropes, suddenly snapped to attention, their cameras raised like weapons. A car turned the corner. It wasn't just a car. It was a statement. It was a vintage silver and black Rolls-Royce Phantom 6, the kind of vehicle that belonged to royalty or heads of state. The Kingsley family crest was discreetly emblazoned on the side door. Brick froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew that car. He had begged Calla to let him drive it once years ago. She had refused, saying it was for family business only. He wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee, to hide in the alleyway, to vanish into the steam of the subway grates. But Tony was watching him. If he walked away, he lost the job. If he lost the job, he lost the bail money. If he lost the bail money, he went to Rikers Island. He was trapped. He forced his legs to move his cheap rubber-soled shoes, scuffing against the pavement. He approached the rear passenger door of the Rolls-Royce as it purred to a stop. The flashbulbs began to pop a blinding strobe light of white explosions. Brick reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the heavy door open. First came the scent. It wasn't the cheap vanilla air freshener of the taxicabs he now took. It was jasmine and white rose Calla's signature scent. Then a shoe touched the pavement, a heel encrusted with diamonds. Calla Vance stepped out. The air seemed to leave Brick's lungs. She was unrecognizable from the woman he had divorced. The mouse he had mocked, the woman he had forced to wear sensible flats and modest colors so she wouldn't outshine him, was gone. In her place stood a queen. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her silhouette before cascading down in a train that shimmered like the night sky. Diamonds, real heavy. Kingsley diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. Her hair, once kept in a severe bun to please him, flowed in soft, luxurious waves around her shoulders. She didn't look downtrodden. She didn't look like a divorcee. She looked like she owned the city. Behind her, stepping out of the other side of the car, was Sir Arthur Kingsley, looking dapper in a tuxedo and leaning on his lion-head cane. And following him was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper Brick had fired for being too old. Mrs. Higgins was now dressed in a sharp, tailored silk suit, holding a tablet looking every bit the chief operations officer she had become. Brick held the door. his body rigid, his head bowed so low his chin touched his chest. "Don't look at me," he prayed. "Please God, just walk past me." But fate, having waited this long to deliver its final lesson, was not going to be lenient. "Thank you," Calla said, her voice clear and melodic. She turned to hand the valet a tip. She paused. The hand holding the door was familiar. The watch was gone, replaced by a pale band of untanned skin where the Patek Philippe used to be. But she knew the hands. "Brick!" The whisper was barely audible over the clicking of the cameras, but it roared in Brick's ears. He slowly lifted his head. Their eyes locked. For a second, the world stopped. The noise of the city faded. It was just the two of them, the conqueror and the conquered. Brick opened his mouth, but his throat was dry as dust. He saw his own reflection in her eyes, a gaunt, broken man in a clown suit. "Calla," he croaked, his voice cracking. He didn't know what to say. "Take me back. I'm sorry. I'm hungry." Sir Arthur stepped up beside his niece. He squinted at the valet, and then a look of dark amusement crossed his face. "Well, well, the wheel of fortune turns quickly, doesn't it, Mr. Sterling?" Mrs. Higgins peered over her spectacles. "Mr. Sterling, please be careful with the clutch. The Rolls is sensitive. Unlike you, it requires a gentle touch." Brick flinched as if slapped. The humiliation was total. The staff he had abused were now looking down on him from the heights of Olympus. "Ellie, please," Brick whispered, stepping closer, ignoring the protocol. I'm in a bad way. The lawyers, they took everything. I'm living in a motel in Queens. I just need a chance. A loan. Anything." The cameras were flashing frantically now. The paparazzi had realized who the valet was. "Fallen CEO begs ex-wife." The headlines would scream tomorrow. Calla looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't hateful. It was something far worse. It was pity. Cold, distant pity. She opened her silver clutch. "You always said I didn't understand the value of money, Brick," she said softly. "You said I was a burden." She pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. "Here," she said, extending it to him. Brick stared at the bill. It was the ultimate degradation. She was tipping him. "Take it," she commanded, her voice gaining the steel of a CEO. "Buy yourself a hot meal. You look unwell." His hand shaking violently. Brick reached out and took the money. The texture of the bill felt like burning coal against his skin. "Thank you. Lady Kingsley." He whispered the title, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Goodbye, Brick," she said. She turned her back on him, taking her uncle's arm. "Come, Arthur. We have a company to run." She began to ascend the red-carpeted stairs, the light of the chandeliers welcoming her home. Brick stood on the curb, clutching the $100, watching the woman he had thrown away ascend to heaven while he remained in hell. "Brick Sterling." A heavy hand landed on his shoulder. Brick spun around. Two NYPD officers stood there, stone-faced. Behind them, a squad car sat with its lights, swirling red and blue, reflecting in the puddles of the gutter. "Yes," Brick breathed. "You're under arrest," the officer said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Arrest for what?" Brick panicked, backing up against the Rolls-Royce. "I'm out on bail. I haven't left the state. New charges filed this afternoon," the officer said, grabbing Brick's wrist and spinning him around. Wire fraud, money laundering, and falsifying corporate records. Your friend Greg Holloway just gave the district attorney the encryption keys to the servers. It's over. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around Brick's wrists. The same wrists that had once worn cufflinks, worth more than the officer's annual salary. "No, please!" Brick shouted as they shoved him toward the squad car. He looked frantically up the stairs. "Kala, help me!" at the top of the stairs, just before the glass doors. Kala paused. She didn't turn around. She simply adjusted her shawl, straightened her spine, and walked into the light, the heavy doors closing behind her. Brick was shoved into the back of the police cruiser. The hard plastic seat was uncomfortable. The cage separated him from the world. As the car pulled away, sirens wailing, Brick pressed his face against the glass. He watched the gala fade into the distance. He watched his past, his future, and his freedom disappear. He looked down at his lap. He had dropped the $100 bill on the floor of the police car. It lay there in the dirt, just out of reach of his cuffed hands. The karma had finally come full circle. He had forced his wife out with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now he was leaving with even less. And that is the story of Brick Sterling, a man who learned the hard way that you should never mistake silence for weakness, and you should never bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand belongs to a Kingsley. Brick thought he could destroy Kala to save himself, but all he did was free her to become the queen she was always meant to be. It's a brutal reminder that in relationships and in life, integrity is the only currency that matters. Money can be lost, jobs can be taken, but the truth always has a way of coming out. Kala walked away with her dignity and her empire, while Brick was left with nothing but a prison sentence and the memory of what he threw away. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What do you think Brick deserved? Did he get off too easy, or was this the perfect punishment? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.